I've decided to devote tonight to what's happening on campus, what's happening in Israel. And Rabbi Manning wrote a summary of her thought, but she won't be teaching tonight. And God willing, we'll be back on schedule next week. And one reason I wanted to take up all the time tonight is I want to set what I want to say to all of you with the fact that we are a community of people who are seekers of meaning. And I don't want us to ever lose sight of the fact, whatever we're doing, whatever political problem we're discussing, whatever philosophical problem we're discussing, I like to teach it in such a way that people are always seeking depth and meaning. Now, when one seeks depth and meaning, one way that we create a container for depth and meaning is through wisdom, which I'm calling knowledge combined with sound judgment for now, with virtue, etc. But when I look at what's happening in the world, and I'm very, very upset by what's happening, I think by nature and by training, I'm trying to figure out for myself what this means to people, what it means to someone to hate Israel and hate Jews, what it means for someone to hate Western civilization, what it means for someone to abuse our regime of rights to the point that they can intimidate and harass others. People are living in worlds of meaning. And we might say something like, this doesn't make sense. Of course it makes sense. Everything makes sense at some level to the person who's doing it, all things considered. So this being said, I like to take you on a bit of a journey. And one reason I'm devoting the time to this is I know some people catch up on YouTube and maybe want to revisit these thoughts, because I think if you follow the narrative I want to share with you, not only will you understand this complexity, what's happening now just defies any simple explanation. It's complex, but even complex things can be explained, and I want to try to do that tonight. And second thing, I think if we understand the complexity, we'll know what to do. We know the job ahead of us. And because it's complex, it's a multifaceted job. One of my fears is when this war is over, and it will end, and when the campus unrest is over, and it will end, we'll go back to sleep. We will not be aware there's something insidious. There's something that is insidious, pervasive, and destructive of Western culture and Western civilization. Now, I'm not an alarmist. I don't see Western culture and Western civilization falling in my lifetime, although in some places it might. I care for us, and I care for what I'm going to call collectively our children, because our children are also seekers of meaning, but they're not being provided with the ability to find meaning and seek meaning, which is one reason they don't have immunities to these horrible ideas that people are teaching, because in the vacuum of meaning, when people don't believe anything, they'll believe anything. So I want to trace some steps, and I also want to be a little bit autobiographical in this. When I first began to encounter the problems I want to share with you, and my own trying to understand it. So just to remember a little bit about my journey. I had a spiritual teacher when I was in high school, and alerted me to a metaphysical reality that I knew, as much as one can know anything, that a metaphysical reality existed. It wasn't my opinion. It wasn't something that was just my subjective experience projected onto the world. As much as one can know, I was inducted into the world of mystery. Now, that was solid knowledge for me. For the many reasons I went into the military, one of them was that when I looked at myself as I was in 18 years old in Southern California, I didn't feel that I could live up to what I knew. Meaning, I knew that I had to change if I could live in loyalty to what I had experienced. So, of the many reasons I went into the military, including being a patriot, including idealistically, wanting to do my little one person's part in reforming a military that had somewhat fallen apart in Vietnam. I wanted to have a kind of a discipline, both personal and I think intellectual and moral, that would help me live in loyalty to what I had experienced. Now, in service of that path, it occurred to me to become a rabbi. Not that I ever saw myself serving a congregation, I really didn't. But the word rabbi was the closest word I knew to a person of wisdom, a professional sage, as it were. Someone who could read antiquarian, dusty books in a library written in strange languages. I had the image that that's what rabbis did all day. And I decided to major in religion. Majoring in religion at what was then, I think, what you might call a third-rate university, but with a first-rate religion program at USC. And it was exactly what I needed, because the core of the program was that religion is a collection of myths and symbols that people, you might say, ingest into their inner lives and create community from that world, have a path to seek meaning, to become people of wisdom, become people of virtue. So we are, as it were, seekers of meaning in the context of a shared symbol system, shared sacred stories, and shared community. Now, there are many, many other things I learned in that truly, really excellent program. And one reason it was such an excellent program is that most of the School of Religion at USC was the graduate doctoral program, and the professors taught the undergraduates as kind of a sideline. So for someone who, like me, who was really ready to study, you might say I got a doctorate level education as an undergraduate. I then went to rabbinical school, where I'll say, with equipped intellectually, I now learned how to read the text. A very good education at the Hebrew Union College. And then I went on to my doctorate. Now, I wrote my doctorate in an area of Talmudic law because I wanted to have great expertise in Talmud, but most of my study was in what you call theory of interpretation, or hermeneutics. Remember, Hermes was the messenger of the gods. And the question is how human beings make meaning out of a textual tradition, how human beings make meaning out of their own lives, out of sacred stories, out of poetry, out of dreams, out of rituals, etc. That was the background focus of my doctoral studies in religion and social ethics. We had the normative ethics track. People wanted to be on an ethics committee of a hospital or something. Theological ethics, people who wanted to be theologians, and the hermeneutical path, which was theory of interpretation. And again, I can't say enough good words about my education at USC. Now, I did go into the congregational rabbinate, but I've never lost that deep, keen interest in human beings as meaning makers. In fact, I will say that those interests, and by the way, when Rob and I met, we shared a world. We met over poetry, and we still meet over poetry. And when we imagine a congregation, it would be a congregation of meaning seekers. It doesn't matter what their theology is, their halakhic practices. It really didn't matter if someone was Jewish or not Jewish. We really didn't care about that. As long as people wanted to engage in being seekers of meaning within what we'll call a wisdom virtue framework, so that people of different opinions and different understanding of the world could all get along with each other and at least hear each other. That was our founding vision, and it still is our vision. So what I want to say tonight is part of what I'll call my foundational principles, my first principles as a human being, certainly as someone who dabbles in the world of poetry and philosophy and theory and so forth, and certainly my calling as a rabbi. All right, that's part one. Now part two. As I taught, and remember, me and Rob and I were very privileged. We had a self-selected community of meaning seekers. And although there might be a person now and then who's a moral relativist or a postmodernist once they understood our culture, they either were able to speak our culture or just went somewhere else that was more conducive to moral relativism and what I'll call a critical theory, neo-Marxian vision of society. It just wasn't ours. When people would complain to me, I'd say, look, this is who we are. If you don't like it, go down the street or found your own synagogue. This is our culture. This is the way we understand the world. It's very broad. It's a big pool, but the pool actually does have some limits. So, for example, are interested in mysticism, more mysticism than Maimonides, I would say. More engaging in sacred myths and narrative than a purely kind of rational language. I'll say somewhat Nietzschean, although I'm a great admirer of Kant, more Nietzschean than Kantian. So everybody who's experienced our community understands very well what I'm talking about. So here's what I encountered. When I would give lectures for national Jewish educational organizations, and also at Brandeis Bardeen and at Jewish high schools, I ran into something very disturbing. I was out of my home territory. What I ran into was a pervasive moral relativism, as if everybody had learned it from the same place, but no one had actually learned it anywhere. It was just in the air. It was in the culture. So I remember, when I would talk about first principles, such as what I would call natural right, the world of moral duties. And part of what moral duties are is to not cause harm to innocents, and so forth. And so I would say, for example, intentional murder of innocents is an absolute wrong. People would say, well, that's just your opinion. And I would say, well, it's my opinion. It's not just my opinion. I believe it is a right opinion unless you can, using reasoning, persuade me that it's a wrong opinion, rooting what you want to say in some kind of axioms. And then people would say, well, you sound, like an absolutist. I said, well, I'm not, although I do have some absolute principles. For example, principles of moral duty and the sacredness of human life. And I don't think I can be talked out of those moral principles. And if someone does not believe we have moral duties and does not believe in the sacredness of human life, we probably can't have a conversation about those things. What was interesting to me is that people, number one, just disagreed with this strongly, but also believed in something that completely contradicted their not being comfortable with my being what I call a moral realist. Moral realist meaning there really are better and worse answers to moral questions. That's my definition of moral realist. For example, I believe in human rights. I believe that all human beings are endowed with rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think rights are real. They're not made up. They exist in some metaphysical dimension. We can't destroy them. They're inalienable, which means they can't be taken away. They can't be given away. As a human being, you are endowed with human rights. Again, that's an axiom of mine. Now, another axiom of mine is language communicates meaning. So this is an anti-Humpty Dumpty argument where he would say words are what I say they mean in Through the Looking Glass. Well, we all know what happened to Humpty Dumpty. He fell off the wall and shattered, and no one, all the king's horses and all the king's men could not put Humpty back together again because he lived in a world, in my opinion, of arbitrary meaning. And that egg cracks and cannot be put back together. There's no possible way that anybody can mean it sincerely, that words do not have meanings, and that we human beings are not united not only by our rights and our moral duties, but our capacity to reason with each other. Now, so here's what I ran into. People would say, well, isn't all morality just a social construct? Now, I would hear this at the Wexner Heritage Foundation. I would hear it when I taught Holocaust at USC, starting in the 1980s, throughout the 90s and early 2000s. It was a default perspective. And I would say to people, where did you learn that? And they said, well, I didn't learn it anywhere. It's just true. That all morality is nothing but a social construct. It's some kind of it's called convention, meaning moral conventionalism. It's as if we've convened and decided, not that we're trying to understand what the human condition is, but just fabricating an opinion about it. And then every opinion at this level is equal to another. So morals is actually a societal construct, which means when I say the right to life, that doesn't refer to anything, the word right. It just refers to a mode of thinking. Now, at the same time, invariably, these people would be very dedicated to civil rights. And I tried to understand how they could say to me, rights are just societal mores, meaning a social construction of reality that is not true or false, it's just an opinion on one hand, but seriously and deeply believe that human beings have rights. I tried to figure this out, and I think I made some headway. And here's what I figured. In my growing up in synagogue, religious school, etc., there's a very great focus on tolerance. And tolerance in those days usually meant racial and ethnic tolerance, including Jews. So when we pled for tolerance, we say, please be tolerant of us and be tolerant of other marginal people. And we Jews, I'm talking about the 60s and 70s, saw ourselves as a marginal in the American experience, and with some great justification. So tolerance meant typically racial and ethnic tolerance, but it didn't really mean intellectual tolerance. Now, I never paid attention to this until, because of my commitment to natural law and natural rights, I became what I'm going to say a perhaps unnecessarily complex thinker about these things. So I found myself somewhat out of step with my fellow Jews and fellow student rabbis, and I had big questions when people who on one hand said it's all relative, nothing's real, it's all subjective, and this is the right answer to a moral question, a kind of an orthodoxy, and I'm not going to reason about it. Now, you might say, as I tried to think about things, I ran into a kind of a buzzsaw, interestingly, of a somewhat of an orthodoxy in Reform Judaism, where, contrary to the way Reform Judaism understood itself, was these and these are the words of the living God, something we all knew from rabbinical school. And when I would have a contrary opinion, I would say, but what about elu ve'elu, these and these? They would say, well, that doesn't apply to that because your opinion is so far off the main that you are, as it were, out of the pool of people who can think morally and meaningfully. I say, well, can we reason? We can't reason. You're disqualified. It's very upsetting to me. Not just the fact that I was disqualified, but the orthodoxy and the refusal to engage in a reasoning process. And I'm not overstating this. This was really something quite constant. So I meditated on these two ideas of both the relativism and the absolutism. So I want to try to put these two together. The relativism is something of a postmodern thought. When you say, well, what is postmodernism? I want to say it as briefly as I can. When you think of modernism, think of the Enlightenment. Think of human rights. Think of Kant. Think of the Hegel's idea of the progression of history, the expansion of human dignity and the expansion of human rights. So the Enlightenment said, whatever your culture, whatever your society, we're all unified by something called reason and ethics. In fact, if you look at the foundations of Reform Judaism, its guiding lights were reason and ethics. There was a response to the Enlightenment, and we don't have a single name for it, but it oftentimes goes under the very inelegant and inapt and inept term romanticism, that argue the human being is not simply a reasoning, rights-endowed creature. We have passion. We have poetry. We have community. So you have, if you look at this is almost all happening in Germany. If you look at German philosophy from the late 1700s, early 1800s, and the different German romanticists, you'll see I'm not going to say two fully distinct understandings of the human condition, but two different focuses of the human condition that really went through German thought continuously. So if modernism is the Enlightenment and rights and reasoning, so I'm a modernist, and postmodernist is we break this down into communities of meaning, and then you add to that a sense that, and this is some of the worst forms of nationalism, the worst forms of social Darwinianism, that all these communities of meaning are actually at war with each other for ascendancy. This is one thing that led to the rise of Nazism and other nationalist movements that not only claim to be different, but claim to be entitled to power over others. So when you think of postmodernism, think that meaning is fragmented into communities, and even more so, that meaning is fragmented into individuals. So here's a very important distinction. If a person ever says, that's just your opinion, I'll say, well, it is not just my opinion, it is an opinion. I can argue my opinion based on axioms, theories, facts, etc. So I have what I call is a justified opinion. And they would say, well, justifying opinions is another one of your opinions. So I would realize, so we actually can't reason with each other. From your theory, I'm locked in my subjective experience, and you're locked in yours. There's no point in talking. If like Humpty Dumpty, words are whatever we want them to mean. Now, here's an analogy that I'll give. When I look at a color and I say, oh, that's blue. Now, I know enough to know that blue means a certain wavelength. And it's just by convention that we call it blue. Enough people call something blue. Physicists finally figured out what that meant, on the spectrum of colors existing at a certain wavelength. And by convention, we call that frequency blue. Now, if I look at that frequency and I say green, people will say, well, you're calling it green, but the frequency is this. I think it's 370 to 490 or something like that. So my subjective experience does not change the physics of the wavelength. Now, what the subjective experience does is interpret that wavelength differently, and that's okay. I have big trouble distinguishing between blue and green, as anybody who knows me well knows. And I realize I just don't have good color perception. It kind of floats around between the blue-green area on the spectrum. All right, so I want you to think about that. So because people experience reality differently, and reality is experienced subjectively, people then think that reality is subjective. Now, that does not follow. If you've ever walked through a room at night in the dark, you know there's a physical reality that you will bump into. Well, moral reality is as real as physical reality, and if you doubt me, let me just ask you, do you believe in human rights? Will you march for human rights? Will you fight for human rights? And are you fighting for just some kind of subjective phantasm, or do you believe that people really have rights? So I have found when I begin to talk about these things, they would say, all morality is subjective and rights are real. So, and those can go together. And I realized the idea of the validity of subjective experience might have been just a meditation on this idea of toleration. So here's what happens. This idea of what I'll call moral relativism, morals is relative to the culture. And I'll say, yes, different cultures have different experience of moral reality, but moral reality, I'm going to say, is real, which means some cultures get it wrong. Cultures that teach murder, cultures that teach slavery, cultures that do not believe in the equal rights of all human beings before the law and before God, they're wrong. Which means when push comes to shove, we may just have to fight them, as what happened in the Second World War. So I think the the message of relativism bumps up against moral realism. So people at the same time would be relativists and moralists. Now, what is this? Again, this moral relativism, this subjectivism, is sometimes called postmodernism. Now, what's interesting for me is the Jewish adults I would teach at Brandeis Bardeen and the Wexner Heritage Program, the high school kids that I would teach at various colloquia, they didn't know it, but they were postmodernists. There is no objective reality. There's no objective moral reality. It's all a construct. I said, okay. However, and I'm glad to say this, they believed in the reality of human rights. Now, they only believe in that reality of human rights. You might say it's kind of compartmentalized, but their overall worldview, invariably, everywhere I went, was both relativistic and utilitarian. Now, this is very important, and and again, not the people that I talked to did not take classes in utilitarianism. They just assumed it was true. They didn't know who Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill were. And remember, utilitarianism, the good is, but what is right is the greatest good for the greatest number. Well, that's an easy thing to say. That comes out very nicely. And then, of course, the question is, well, what is the greatest good? Of course, if you're a utilitarian, you can't answer that question. So in my careful study of John Stuart Mill, he's really struggling with that. Because if the greatest good for the greatest number comes down to a survey, meaning what do the greatest number of people think the good is, John Stuart Mill had to admit there's a lot of vulgar people out there. And their taste in what is good might be completely contrary, which you might call highbrow culture or higher culture. So he really struggled with this. And he had to come down to say, well, the good isn't from a survey of what the hoi polloi believe is good. It's something that is somewhat managed by elites. So whenever someone says, I'm a utilitarian, the greatest good for the greatest number, and you have the temerity to ask, well, what exactly do you mean by the good? And how do you establish what is good? Remember, this is the weak link that in utilitarianism where everything falls. And if it comes down to, well, you survey the people, and then you can ask, well, what if the people get it wrong? What if south of the Mason-Dixon line, they did a survey and the majority of people said slavery is, overall, the greatest good for the greatest number? Does that mean it's good? Does that mean it's right? Does that mean it's true? Of course not. So you cannot determine the good from a survey. You might say what we call the good. And again, this is a complex idea, but we're not going to be afraid of complexity here. The good is a core part of human reality. You can't look through the good and see something behind the good. There are some words in language where the reality stops there. And that's why when you try to define the true, the right, and the good, they all fold into each other because you've hit the limits of human thought where there's nothing behind it. Now, as you try to talk about it, these words are entailed with each other, but there's no, you can't go any further in analyzing, is the good constituted by something that is not the right, the true, etc. We've actually reached the limits of human language. This is part of what philosophers do. Well, we have this reality, this moral reality called the right, the true, the good. Let's talk about what that means, as opposed to saying these words do not indicate a reality. They're stand-in words for something else. For example, they're stand-in words for a survey. They're stand-in words for a collection of opinions. Well, then that is not about morality at all. Now we're back to relativism. So what I want to make sure through this lengthy wind-up, but I believe you need it, the good, the right, the true are foundational words, and there's nothing behind it, because if you try to go behind it and say, well, it comes down to a survey of opinions, then the words the right, the good, and the true have lost their meaning. So one reason I dislike David Hume so much, because David Hume, for example, said, when I say the good, I mean good for me, meaning my preference. So David Hume was, I call him an intellectual smart aleck. He said, prove me wrong. Well, of course you can't prove him wrong. If he truly believes that the word good is self-referential, there's nothing called the good except for my preference. So he would say, when I say murder is bad, he means don't murder me. I actually think he's wrong. I actually think murder is bad. Well, David Hume was convinced that he had solved all moral theory. In fact, David Hume was quite surprised that anybody wrote anything on moral theory after his books. He said, I solved it. Why is anybody continuing to write? Well, he's wrong. That's why people continue to write. And again, I'm going to say, it's not my opinion that he's wrong, because I'm a moral realist. And remember, reality is something that you bump into. For example, when you try to talk about human rights. If you want to talk about human rights, you will bump into the fact that rights are real, that human beings are endowed with rights, and they are so real that we will fight for them. We will die for them. We will kill for them. That's how real they are. Right. So that's one thing that's happening as our young people go to college. I mean, I think I'm going to say this was endemic to my experience with Jewish population. Tolerance had turned into relativism, kind of an abhorrence of moral realism, that they would say, well, that's absolutism, and being absolute was bad. I said, no, it's actually called moral realism, not absolutism. But still, people just felt uncomfortable with it. So they go off to college with no sense of moral reality. Now, if you don't have a sense of moral reality, again, they don't really believe it, because the acid test is human rights. But again, they haven't integrated these two compartments. So when someone is very convincing that there's this other reality that they make a case for, I say if anybody, especially a young impressionable person, does not have a strong sense of moral realism, for example, human rights, so they have no deep theory, they can be convinced of the next thing that I want to speak about briefly, which is I'll call neo-Marxism. Now, remember, relativism, I think, brings down people's immunities for bad ideas, and then neo-Marxism sneaks in and fills the vacuum. Now, here I want to bring in critical theory as briefly as I can. Remember, by critical theory, critique, going back all the way back to Plato and Kant and others, critique means look inside of what's happening with something. So you might say Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was critique of economy. No one really understood how the economy worked. And I think, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations really was a prodigious step forward in understanding what is wealth and how does it happen and what do we do to keep it and so forth. So when you think of critique, for example, literary criticism, the critique is what's really happening inside. Now, what Marx believed was that our economy more or less is constructive of the ruling elite and the oppressed proletariat. Now, I'm simplifying Marx, but remember, for Marx, capitalism did not mean greed. Capitalism was a relationship between the ruling elite and the oppressed proletariat. But Marx was also a moralist. He said this is the structure, and belief systems tend to support the structure. So he said the Unterbau, the substructure, is the ruling elites versus the proletariat. But then the superstructure will be all these ideas that justify this relationship. So remember, capitalism does not mean greed. Capitalism is a relationship between the ruling elite and the proletariat. So Marx thought this was very wrong. So he believed, as a Hegelian, there would be a somewhat inevitable historical progression toward the failure of this relationship and the rule of the proletariat. So he said, it's inevitable. As a Hegelian, he just thought these things just get worked out in history. But on the other hand, we need to push history forward a little bit, which is why you have revolutionaries. Revolutionaries don't say, well, it's inevitable, I don't need to do anything. Revolutionaries saw themselves as acting for history. If history was headed toward overcoming this relationship of the ruling elite and the proletariat, then revolutionaries were acting on behalf of the inevitable future. Now, so critical theory is almost always some kind of Marxism or neo-Marxism, and therefore this is the belief of the oppressor and the victim. That's why their anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti this structure I'm talking about, and so anti-capitalist. And remember, their reality is ruling elite versus the oppressed. Now, if you put these two together, imagine a person comes into college, they don't really have a belief system. They don't have what I'll call an intact sense of meaning, nor a culture that preserves it, such, what we'll call dense religion. For example, someone who goes to church or synagogue constantly is constantly the sense of moral realism, the sense of the reality of words, the sense of the sacred is so present that postmodernism and neo-Marxism can't be foisted upon them, because they'll say, wait a minute, the worth of a human being is not determined by their social class. You might have a proletariat who's a despicable human being, and you might have an owner of a company who's actually a wonderful human being. So the content of their character is not determined by their social class. Now, Marxism would say, well, you find your oppressed, and they always have the moral high ground. You find the oppressor, and they have no moral standing. And one reason I'm so against DEI, which is not about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, if it is, I'd be all for it. What it's really about is deconstructing what they consider to be the nature of reality, which is oppressor versus victim. And I just don't think that's, there is that. I'm not saying there's not oppression, there's not racism, but that's not the totality of human beings. One reason I know that is, I know working people who are awful people. And I know wealthy people who steadily give money away and work for social causes and work constantly for the betterment of humankind. So if someone says, well, the wealthy people are all bad and at a moral disadvantage, and the so-called working people are at a moral advantage, I just say, I don't buy it. I oftentimes say, you might be right, but you haven't demonstrated it to me. Now I'm going to go to to what I'll call the neo-Marxism, and this is why it's very strange how neo-Marxism has taken hold in the Islamic world. Remember, neo-Marxism is more or less establishes a culture of resentment, a culture of complaint, and oftentimes a culture of shame. One thing that Western imperialism did, and if you could just imagine this, if you're born here, a foreign country coming in, taking over our country for generations, destroying our culture, destroying our economy with a rapacious desire to use our natural resources for their ends, and we are too weak to repel them. Now, when they pull out, we are left with a shattered culture and a shattered economy. So there's great resentment against colonialists and imperialists. But also, and you can look at this in Eric Hoffer's works on the True Believer, required reading for everybody. Francis Fukuyama's book, titled escaping me, but he talked about the dysthymia, which means the unease of spirit of people who see themselves as victims of imperialism and colonialism. Right? There is not only resentment, there's also shame, asking the question, why did they colonize us? Why did we colonize them? Well, the short answer to that is Islam was imperialistic, for example, and colonized. In fact, the Byzantine region called Palestine was Christian, we call Orthodox Christian. It was colonized and taken over in imperialistic fashion by the Caliphate. So yes, Muslims were colonialists and imperialists, but it ended with the First World War. So people's memories are short. It's as if all reality is determined only by the First World War. Now, we bring this up to date. What's happening with Israel, in my mind, Israel has become, along with our Torah portion, the scapegoat for symbolizing all of the guilt, the collective guilt of imperialism, colonialism, and oddly, capitalism, because Israel was a socialist country all the way up until 1977. Now, here's the pushback. For there to be imperialism, there had to be an empire. For there to be colonialism, there had to be some kind of imperial state that was sending colonists. Now, if you can engage in a reasoned debate, it's clear that Jews were refugees and immigrants. Refugees are not colonists. Immigrants are not colonists. They're called immigrants. They're called refugees. However, I think there's a deep need in many parts of the world to find a symbolic enemy of colonialism and imperialism. And I think, again, if these words have meanings, and I read what I'll call the radical left says. I don't mean the political left. Give a fair shake for the working person. I have great sympathies, and some of my positions are very much identified with the political left. So I mean the radical left, which uses postmodernism as the setup for neo-Marxism. Israel stands for all of the sins of Western civilization, a scapegoat, as it were. That's why our Torah portion is so apt. And Palestinians have been, as it were, the banner of the fight against colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism, with the Jew thrown in as the Jew being the quote-unquote ruling elite. Now, though so this idea that the Jew is the ruling elite in the Marxian scheme is something very difficult. For example, I read on some, again, radical leftist Islamic source, they noted university presidents are disproportionately Jewish. So they're ruling universities. And I said, well, I don't think they're ruling anything from what I can tell. They're not very good rulers. And so what? Most of them are dedicated liberals, and maybe even neo-Marxists. So on one hand, academia is filled with neo-Marxists and, I'll say, leftist liberals. I think that's just a fact. And, if you don't like it, then do something about it. But, and I think that's good for the left. But on the other hand, that's ignored, and they're just called Jews. So their identity is the Jewish ruling elite, but not of their ideas. So because they're a Jew, they're an oppressor by definition, whatever their politics are. And that's why this is so actually infuriating. Because if we knock over back to postmodernism, you actually can't reason. You can't debate, because for them, words mean what we want them to mean. So I'll just bring this home a little bit. We'll talk about the idea of genocide. I'm going to pause here just a little bit, and I want to know if I can see gallery view in Zoom, if that's possible. If it's not, it's okay. This will have to be edited out of the tape. Sorry to say. All right, not possible. I can't see any of you, and I would prefer. Okay, recording starts back up here. So, for example, the claim of genocide. Now, when I've been in communication with many of you, and people say they're saying genocide, I say, do they know what the word means? More or less, they mean it whatever they want it to mean. Does it mean civilian casualties in war? Does it mean unnecessary civilian casualties in war? What does the word mean? Well, it means whatever Palestinians are going through, because remember, Palestinians represent the neo-Marxian critical theory struggle of, you might say, the oppressed versus the elite. So genocide is a rhetorical word. It doesn't refer to anything. Now, I taught Holocaust for many years, so I think I know what genocide means. There's a genocide in Europe. There's a genocide in Rwanda. There's a genocide in China. I think you might say the Russian invasion of Ukraine comes close to genocide, because there's a desire to destroy Ukrainian culture. So it's a kind of a destruction of culture, but there is no intent, I think, to murder every Ukrainian. That's a gray area in genocide studies. I don't like it that genocide, which means the murder of a people, has come to include the destruction of a culture, but I'll accept it, because that's where genocide studies have gone. Whatever Israel is doing, if you look at the Israeli I'll say administration of the disputed territories, the West Bank, there's no attempt to destroy Islamic culture whatsoever. Israel was happy to live alongside Gaza. They could have any culture they wanted. The war only began not as a war against Palestinians and a war against Islamic culture, it's a war against Hamas that attacked Israel. So now for us, people will say, I mentioned this last time, what's Israel doing in Gaza? It's a war against Hamas. Wasn't Hamas responding to Israeli oppression? Well, remember, for them, it's definitional because Israel is quote unquote imperialistic, colonialist, so-called white, and Palestinians are the oppressed, the colonized, the victims, and any revolutionary activity is self-justified. In fact, I was distressed to know when I learned about liberation movements, and I remember reading this and I really shuddered, that from a liberation movement perspective, the murder of a colonialist is inherently justified, man, woman, or child, because their mere presence as a colonialist was an act of violence. Now, you hear that today. The mere presence of Jews in Israel is an act of violence. Therefore, murdering Jews is therefore resistance. Now, this sounds strange to us. We who are not indoctrinated in neo-Marxian, anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist, and anti-capitalist rhetoric. But when you hear them talk, that's their worldview. I would go as far to say as it's their religion. So the sad part of this is there's no talking. It's like someone to try to talk me out of being Jewish and my trying to talk an evangelical Christian out of believing in Jesus. It's not worth it. I mean, we can find out we might be able to agree on, I hope a lot. But with the neo-Marxian critical theory point of view, language is front-loaded with a series of meanings that, from my perspective, defy what language does. Is it communicates as, I think I know what a colonist is, and Israel is certainly not colonistic. I think I know what imperialism is. That's not Israel. I think I know what an aggressor is, and an aggressor is not defined by your status. It's defined by an act. All right, so that's as far as the extremists who have, in many ways, taken over the rhetoric on college campuses. Now, what about this phenomenon of all these young people? Well, remember, part of the so-called, what I'll call the religion of the radical left, not the liberal left, the radical left, is occupations, demonstrations. From real hooligans, destructive people, to just what I call radical brats. This is a term that Jonah Goldberg used. A radical brat is someone who pushes the limits of authority to the very edge. So on one hand, it doesn't seem arrestable, and if you arrested him for it, it fills in the theater of police violence, and they kind of intuitively know where the line is. So the radical brats, meaning I'm going to test the limits of authority until there's pushback, are being egged on by the radical extremists who want to lure the police into a police riot, which would happen at the in many places. I think it happened. I don't have to enumerate them, but extremists have learned how to lure police into a police riot, which plays right into the hands of the extremists and can take what I'll call radical brats, meaning people testing the limits of authority, into extremists. That's my analysis of what's happening on the campuses. You have people who are really devoted believers in the what I'll call radical left, anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, who believe this with all of the fervor of a religious belief. They have a language that they cannot be talked out of, and there's no reasoning to be done. You cannot talk about these words because the words express what I'm going to call at least a quasi-religious point of view. Now, so they've, as it were, taken over language. So sometimes when a person says, "What do you mean by genocide?" They get angry, which just shows their incapacity to reason. So for example, when I've shown people the numbers of civilian casualties in Gaza are implausible to the point of being absurd, And that's been demonstrated by statisticians. All you have to do is look it up. I understand Dan Senor, S-E-N-O-R, has a great podcast on this. But if you mention this, they just get angry and shout you down, which is what extremists are trained to do. Don't let a contrary opinion stand. Now, so what do? What's our future? Our future is, in my opinion, and I think I have my thoughts together, and I want to publish some of this. So speaking for us, and this is mainly a Jewish community here, we have to teach moral realism, not just human rights, but natural rights. The importance of a moral reality. Push back against relativism. Push back against utilitarianism. Have a theory of the human being that's minimally has, I'll say, 4 components. First of all, we're endowed with rights. Okay? And that's not just my postmodern opinion. I believe it is real, and I believe you do too, because I can do a stress test if what your stand on human rights are. I think we know it's real, not just an opinion. So that's a foundation. Number 2, the nature of language. Language and reasoning go very carefully together. That's how we can build a society. That's how we can build the polis, the city, because not only do we believe in a moral reality, we can talk about it. We can reason with each other. Language is inherent to humanity. Reasoning is inherent to humanity, and seeking meaning is inherent to humanity. And when people do not have a viable meaning system, what I call an atrocious meaning system can fill that vacuum. So what do we have to do? We have to be insistent proponents of moral realism, the nature of language to describe reality, the profundity of reasoning, and creating communities of such deep meaning that these extremist meanings can't get a foothold because we already live in worlds of deep meaning, including the sacredness of human life.